Welcome to the Minimalist Educator Podcast, a podcast about paring down to refocus on the purpose and priorities in our roles, with co-hosts and co-authors of the Minimalist Teacher Book, Tammy Musiowski-Borneman and Christine Arnold.
In this episode, we speak with Ming about the importance of having the courage to get right to the heart of things, particularly in communication. Her pared down pointer is some wise words from Brené Brown and Kim Scott. Ming Shelby is a TEDx speaker, a national board-certified educator who has dedicated her career to inspiring students, teachers, and administrators through learning experiences. Ming is currently the Director of Professional Learning in the suburbs of Chicago. She believes that courage is the critical ingredient for student transformation. Ming has facilitated workshops for adults and youth in Asia, Australia, Europe, and the United States. She also builds courage beyond the classroom to support kids and adults through her podcast, Courage Up. Welcome to this week's episode of the Minimalist Educator Podcast. This week we are chatting with Ming Shelby, and we are super excited because Ming is such a great speaker and I just love hearing her voice. So welcome to the show, Ming.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with both of you.
Speaking of voices, so you and I met on that app Clubhouse like a couple of years ago. I feel like it was kind of like a COVID thing that started. And I remember that you would often be in an SEL room with Krista, and then I just always would go into her room and listen to you talk about things. And you just have one of those very inviting voices. So I like listening to you talk. So thanks for being here.
Oh, that's so kind, Tammy. You know, we're always our own worst critics of our voices. So when I watch back videos of myself I'm like, who is that? That can't be me. I don't sound like that.
Well, and other people think very differently, right? So
exactly. Yeah.
But that was such a great space for, I don't even know if it's still a thing or not, but it was such a great space to get to know people and just talk about, different things. And I know one of the things that you talk about a lot is courage, which is a really, a huge topic in any field, but in education, it can be particularly hard to be a courageous teacher or a courageous leader. So can you tell us a bit about how you kind of got into that way of thinking? This is what I want to focus on and work with people about.
Yeah, it's funny because so in 2018, I do a word of the year. Like, what's your word? And so for me, I chose courage. And I reference back to 2018 being this year of courage for me. But when I'm reflecting, my whole life was these courageous moments along the way. So to backtrack back to way when I was really little, so my family came to the United States when I was only 6 months old. And first of all, I can't even imagine that, like traveling, leaving this country where your family, with a 6-month-old baby, and we just moved to the States. And so there are these moments where my parents were still learning English. My mom was like, I feel pretty good conversationally, but I remember that making doctor's appointments for the family. Like I would be the one as an elementary age student making those phone calls, practicing that courage muscle. I remember going through the drive-through. My mom would have me sit in the back, like right behind the driver, and I would be ordering what we wanted for food. And so there's like these little moments when I'm telling my husband, I'm like, did you ever do this? And he's like, no. Like, did you ever have to like call? And he's like, no, my mom, so it's like all those little moments led me up to it. Um, and even things of like speaking Chinese when I didn't feel comfortable when everyone around me was speaking English. So in 2018, I had the word of courage. And of course, the universe is like, okay, you want to practice courage? Let me just put you in all these challenging situations. Like, let's go for it. And so I really had to be like, okay, I asked for this. Like, what am I going to do when I'm in these hard situations, tough situations? How do I want to show up? And one big lesson that I learned was it doesn't matter about what other people think of me or what else, whatever else is happening is that I wanted to make sure that in these courageous moments, I showed up true to me while still being kind to others and holding space. And so if I was proud of how I acted or showed up in that moment, I was like, okay, like I'm slowly building this courage muscle.
So yeah, a lot about risk taking there and being authentically you and things like that. That sounds like that is wrapped up in your,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, totally. And I think too, working with teachers and being a teacher for many years, I think one of the most courageous things that we can do is stand up to our colleagues. Often I'm in spaces, and I don't know if Tammy and Christine, you can relate to this.
Oh
I
yeah, I'm
remember
like,
being in
tell me more, Ming. I want to hear. Tell me more about this.
I remember being a classroom teacher, and a colleague of mine was late every day. And so I would help set up the classroom. I would make sure the students knew what they were doing, greeted them. And it was pretty consistent on how often she would show up late to work. And at one point, I was like, is the principal going to do something about this? And I went to the principal, a young, naive 20-something-year-old is like, she's always late. Like, what are you going to do about this? And she's like, well, have you had the conversation with her yet? I'm like, me? What? I'm just her colleague. Like, this is not my place to have that conversation. And I think we often have those conversations in our head, like, oh, it shouldn't be me. Like, I'm not the one that can hold her accountable to this or be having it. That seems like a boss's job. And then now, as I continue on my leadership journey, I'm like, wait, it sometimes the most powerful conversations are those of your colleagues to colleague, right? Like for me to take ownership of, I care enough about this teammate to have this hard conversation. I care enough about these students to have this conversation. So looking back on it, things like that, I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, I had a choice in that. Like I totally had power in that moment.
That is really powerful, actually. Yes. And I think too, we kind of dismiss this idea that probably your colleague or any of our colleagues, right, when we have to
Hmm.
have a difficult conversation or we're thinking about it, they would probably
Hmm.
rather hear it from us, right? Like
Yes.
rather than hearing it from the admin or, whoever the person in charge is. But I think that we dismiss how grateful a colleague would be like, thanks for bringing that to my attention, or like, my intention is not to be late, but for some
Yeah.
reason I just can't get myself together, like whatever the thing
Yeah.
is. And then maybe
Yeah.
that conversation ends up being like the catalyst for not being late as often because you're showing that you care. And I think, we talk a lot about relationships on the podcast, and it really
Hmm.
does come down to how we are relating to the people and how we're connecting to each other, to stay focused on what really matters, like why we're teaching or why we're leading. So, yeah, that's really powerful.
Tammy, so that resonates so much with me. So years later, I found out from a different colleague that this colleague, her husband had some really severe mental health issues. And so it was hard. They had a young baby too. So it was hard for her to get out of the house because of her family situation. And I think back, like, what if I had just said something like, hey, noticing that it's hard for you to get here on time. Like, is there something that I can do to help support you? And I wonder if I opened that conversation up in that moment, like she would have been felt safe enough to open up to me, like, yeah, I'm going through some tough stuff at home. It's really hard for me to get out of the house. Like, I really appreciate how you help my students get started right away. That helps me a ton, and I didn't do that. So I'm not friends with this colleague, but I do wonder, like, if I chose to be courageous in the moment, having that conversation and finding empathy instead of judgment, like what our relationship might have looked like in those years of working together.
Something for us all to think about, I think, there. Do you have any tips for when we're dealing with people? You know, teaching is high stress environment. Often, you know, people have so much on their plates, and you know, it might seem like the people around you are, you know, just one more straw is going to break that camel's back. Do you have any words of advice if we're dealing with people like that, but we still want to have that courageous conversation, but we know it could be, you know, the last thing they need at that moment?
Yeah, Christine, you bring up such a great point. I think everyone's working so hard right now, um, whatever perspective they have. I think whoever, all the people in education are working really hard right now. So with the like one more thing, right? Everyone's plate is already so full. Like, what I can't have this conversation and this is just going to send me over the edge. I think if we took a step back, having the conversation would remove another straw. I don't know if that goes with the analogy, but sometimes it's the anticipation leading up to having the conversation or the buildup of the frustration, or it's all the other stuff, the gobbledygook that leads to that. And oftentimes, more often than not, after having the hard conversation when you can just say, hey, I know this is going on. I'm thinking it might be related to this. How do you see it? Can you help me understand? And that open dialogue just kind of eases the tension. And in my experience, it's almost like the bricks have been lifted off the shoulders, and you're like, okay, it feels like the plate is a little bit more manageable now.
Just
So
following
I
on
guess what I'm
from,
saying,
yeah,
Christine,
good.
is just do it. Just do it.
Okay. And I'm just wondering, just as a quick add-on, would you always recommend that these sorts of things happen face to face, or do you think there is a possibility for it to be in other forms of communication, or should we stick to the person to person, face to face method?
I think a pigeon carrier note is probably the best.
Via fax, yeah.
But I think it depends on your relationship. I always think somehow if they can hear your voice, whether it's face to face, a Zoom, a phone call. I think email is the most impersonal and you can't hear the intonation, right? Like one way you might type it may seem so disarming, but then when you add a certain tone to it, you're like, oh, this becomes nasty somehow. And so, yeah, face to face for me is ideal. And then I think because it's sometimes it's so hard having that conversation. So the person you're talking to can see like the effort you're putting in, the
Mm-hmm.
courage that it takes from you to go forth and do that. And it kind of evens the playing field, in my opinion. What do you think, Christine? Do you agree, Christine, in your experience?
I think so, because my experience, I feel like, is when it's in an email or written down, they're kind of forgetting that there is a human on the other end of that, it feels like.
Mm-hmm.
So in those moments
Mm-hmm.
of stress or overwhelm or annoyance, irritation, anger, whatever it is, it's a lot easier to bang out something than it is to have that
Yeah.
same level of intensity of face to face, because you can't ignore
Yeah.
the person standing in front of you. So I think if you can have that face to face moment, I know it's tricky in a busy day, but I think it definitely does help to bridge those, bridge those issues and come back to who you are and what you're really trying to achieve.
Yeah. I agree with you. Yeah. I think we can be a little bit more human when we're face to face.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm. Yeah. And just thinking about that too, like how has you focusing on having courageous conversations with people and then, potentially kind of even diffusing something that might have become something else in an email thread or whatever. How has that potentially, or has it helped like other people just kind of stay more focused then on what we really need to do? Because we know that we can check the email quick and read it and be like, wow, that's like not what I want to hear right now. But
Mm-hmm.
has that kind of just helped people stay focused when you can just focus on like, okay, we're going to talk about this rather than let it fester.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Tammy. I'm thinking as you're talking because I think so, because if something's nabbing at the back of you, right? Like your attention's going to be semi-diverted, whether it's conscious or not subconscious. Like, okay, she's still not here. Like the kids are, and even let's say we're planning together and we're planning this great lesson, but in the back of my mind, I was like, well, why does it matter? We're planning this. You might not be here that day, right? Like these like little voices that somehow interject your voice into the your conscious. But if we have the conversation talking about being on time, and as we're planning, I could be like, okay, I might here are some things that I might have to get ready for both of us. Like my inner dialogue might turn a little bit to
Yeah,
be
I
more
think
helpful than to be more judgy. I think I was more judgy. Sorry, Tammy, go ahead.
no, that's fine. And I think naturally we just kind of go to that place, right? Where you it's a natural thing to make a judgment because we don't know all of the story behind what
Hmm.
what people are doing. But it does make me think about how I, in my role right now, really have to focus on people's preferences of communication too, because
Mm,
there are some people that respond quickly to a text.
hmm.
And like, thankfully, I'm in a small school, so we have like just a text thread sometimes. But I know that not everybody reads their email at the same time, so I can't expect that people like I don't expect people to read it during the day. But sometimes if I do need a quick answer, I can just like go directly to that person or just shoot a
Hmm.
quick text and be like, can you just let me know, blah, blah, blah. And that person, I think that alleviates some stress for people in particular when you choose that method of communication that is their preference because not everybody likes to read the email, even though it's a thing that we all have to do. But just letting them know that, like, I'm recognizing that you appreciate a text more because it's more accessible for you and you
Hmm.
can just answer quickly. I think that alleviates a lot of angst in communication because then it's not sitting as this festering thing like, oh, now I have to think
Hmm.
about like, how am I going to talk to this person about this thing and whatever. I know that's where my mind goes and it's so distracting.
Yeah.
It's so distracting. And so, like, when we can eliminate some of those distractions in communication, it just becomes so much easier.
For
Yeah.
sure.
What have you learned about yourself and others working on this kind of thing? Like, just knowing that we have to communicate in this way with each other.
I think it's Freud that says when you're young, you're driven by ego and then slowly it fades, right? But I think ego comes back after like when you're in your 20s. I think like maybe it's just me. Like we don't want to look bad, we don't want to do it wrong or and so I think what I learned is really like humility and being humble and approach like there's always more than one side to a story. And I heard this trainer once said, approach from a posture of curiosity versus a posture of judgment. And so when I go into whether it's hard conversations, hard situations, frustrating situations, whatnot, I try, and I'm not doing this perfectly by any means, is try to think like, why might that person act that way? Or what do they really want out of the situation instead of going straight to like, oh, they're trying to sabotage this work or they are in it for themselves. It's so quick to jump to those negative stories. Um, so for me, it's about like, okay, seeing it from another person's perspective and having the humility to do so.
And have you found that this, we've been talking a lot about courage and communication today, but have you
Mhm.
found these ideas about courage connected to any other areas of your life, like how you take on new challenges or things like that?
Yeah, I'm thinking like parenting. I have 7-year-old twins and I don't know, every day is a new challenge with that, right? And this is also communication too, Christina. It's funny, like when they were young and they did something that I was like, why did you do that? Right. And like the courage to just show up and not go off the rail. Or recently, one of my boys, they're identical twins, and it just showed up that they're starting to be in competition with each other, one more than the other. And he's said, well, I'm the dumb brother. I'm dumb at reading.
Oh
I know. And it
no.
just like I just broke my heart because like you're a great reader and your brother is a great reader. He likes right. So I think courage in that moment is to like put me aside and show up for him and saying things like, thank you for telling me that. Tell me more, right? Like just that the courage to show up and be in that space with him. I think like courage is can transcend so many different pieces, right? Whether it's a risk-taking a move, whether
Mhm.
it's a being quiet. Um, and in my experience, Christine, I'm thinking back, a lot of them are the conversations. I think as especially, I don't know if this is true in the Netherlands or in Hawaii, but in Midwest, we have this Midwest nice culture where it's like, oh, we're so nice and like all that people kind of tiptoe around each other, and not get too like, okay, listen up here. Like I care enough about you to have this conversation. Like, oh yeah, that dress looks great on you. And meanwhile, you're like, why is she wearing that? You know?
Yeah. 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 That's such a, yes, that's a funny thing to bring up, but it's very true. Like, I feel like that's very Canadian because that's where I'm from, right? So it's very not New Yorker at all. That's, that was
Oh, and
No.
it's
overseas for
it's
me,
not
but
Dutch. Yeah, no, Dutch are very, very direct in their communication style.
yeah.
How does that, Christine, how does that translate with for you? Like as a person who works with multiple country people and like when someone's direct with you, in my experience, we were like, oh, that was harsh. I'm like, that wasn't really harsh, but it feels harsh to them. But do you
Yeah,
have I don't know, do you
yeah.
feel that too? Or
Yeah, definitely. And I think, I'm Australian, but I've lived in, Asia for quite a long time as well. And so to have this sort of very direct communication style, it did really shock me the first, when I first moved here for sure. But I have to say I now kind of find it quirky and sort of endearing. And so when people say things that are very like might seem very blunt and rude, it kind of makes me giggle now because I appreciate it. It's quite nice for a change to have people, tell you exactly what they think. So I enjoy it these days.
yeah. But maybe it was an acquired taste.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And a lot of like explaining from my Dutch colleagues as well, like their perspective on it and why they think it's important to speak like that. And I think that hearing their point of view and their experiences helped me understand where they're
Mm-hmm.
coming from.
At this point in the show, Ming, we've
Mm-hmm.
talked a lot about a hard subject, actually,
Mm-hmm.
having courage and the way we communicate with people. And I've brought a lot to think about from our conversation. As we
Yeah.
wind down, we always ask our guests for a pair down pointer. So, some kind of tip that you have could be from our conversation or from just life in general that you want to share with our listeners.
Christine gave me a heads up of one, and I'm breaking the rules because I have two, which I hope
Sure.
your listeners are okay with.
Yes.
So I'm thinking of one. It's in this huge, um, like a painted board in my house, and it's a quote from Brene Brown, and it says, "Show up, be seen, live brave." And I know this is probably familiar to both of you and your listeners as well. Of having that courage to show up, do the hard things, um, be transparent in who you are, be seen by others, and then and live bravely. So that's one is show up, be seen,
Yeah.
live brave. And this is supposed to be the pare down section, but I've somehow rambled more during this section than the others.
That's okay.
And then the other is, it's from, oh my gosh, why am I blanking on her name? From Radical Candor. The author, her name is right on the tip of my tongue right now. I can see her face. She says, care personally, challenge directly. So balancing those both elements.
Oh, that's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have links to both of those resources you just mentioned too. We'll add a link for Brene Brown and the book Radical Candor, because it is a very interesting book. Thank you for your time today, Ming. It's been great talking to you. I know our listeners, I'm sure, loved that episode. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.
Today's episode was brought to you by Plan Z Professional Learning Services, forward-thinking educator support. Find out more at planzplservices.com.
Be sure to join Tammy and Christine and guests for more episodes of the Minimalist Educator podcast. They would love to hear about your journey with minimalism. Connect with them at PlanZPLS on Twitter or Instagram. The music for the podcast has been written and performed by Gaia Moretti.